The night Dutch Schultz lost control over Harlem did not begin with gunfire. It began with silence, a thick, suffocating silence that settled over Lenox Avenue like fog rolling off the Hudson. The kind of silence that only comes when men who have ruled by fear realize, too late, that fear is no longer working. Dutch Schultz sat in the back room of a Harlem nightclub he did not own, but believed he controlled. His fedora rested on the table beside a half-finished glass of rye. Around him stood his men, Jewish gangsters from the Bronx, hard-eyed enforcers who had broken strikes, smashed unions, and buried men in unmarked ground upstate. They had come north that night, expecting obedience. Instead, they felt watched. Outside, Harlem was alive. Street lamps hummed, shoes tapped pavement, laughter drifted from doorways, music spilled from open windows, blues, jazz, the pulse of a neighborhood that refused to bow. This was not the Lower East Side. This was not the Bronx. And Dutch Schultz, for the first time in years, felt like a foreigner. He had been warned not to come personally, advised to send word, send muscle, send threats. But Schultz had built his empire on the belief that showing up mattered. That presence alone could bend men. That belief was about to cost him everything. Because Harlem was not just territory. Harlem was defended, and the man who defended it had not yet entered the room. Before that night, Dutch Schultz's name carried weight across New York City. He was a prohibition kingpin, a numbers racketeer, a man who made judges nervous, politicians obedient. Newspapers called him reckless. Rivals called him violent. Law enforcement called him untouchable. In Harlem, they called him temporary. Harlem in the early 1930s was a city within a city. Black-owned businesses lined the avenues. Numbers runners worked openly in daylight. Churches, barbershops, nightclubs, and storefronts formed a tight ecosystem where information traveled faster than police, radios. At the center of that ecosystem stood one man, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. He was not the loudest gangster. He did not posture in public or issue threats through intermediaries. He dressed sharp, spoke deliberately, and listened more than he talked. His reputation came not from cruelty, but from consistency. If Bumpy Johnson gave his word, it held. If he warned you once, there would not be a second time. And if you crossed a line in Harlem, especially if you disrespected its people, he would respond in a way that made the lesson permanent. Bumpy had risen under Stephanie St. Clair, the numbers queen of Harlem, learning the business from a woman who fought banks, police, and politicians in court as fiercely as she did in the streets. By the time Schultz's empire began creeping north, Bumpy was already the acknowledged enforcer of Harlem's order. Dutch Schultz did not care. To Schultz, Harlem was just another revenue stream, another place where numbers could be taxed, runners flipped, and territory absorbed. He believed black neighborhoods lacked the organization or the willingness to resist. That miscalculation was his first mistake. The second was underestimating how deeply personal this would become. The challenge began quietly. Schultz's men started leaning on Harlem numbers runners, demanding a percentage for protection. Some complied out of fear. Others were beaten. A few disappeared. The message was clear. Dutch Schultz was claiming Harlem as his own. Bumpy Johnson did not respond immediately. He watched. He listened. He gathered names, patterns, routes. He learned which runners had been approached, which had been threatened, which had been turned. He let Schultz believe the intimidation was working. That patience unsettled Schultz more than resistance would have. Because Harlem did not erupt. It tightened. Meetings were held behind closed doors. Money moved differently. Runners stopped operating in predictable patterns. Schultz's collectors found doors closed that had once been open. Then one of Schultz's men made a mistake. He slapped a Harlem elder in public, a man known in the neighborhood not for crime, but for organizing church drives and helping families bury their dead. The slap echoed down the block. People stopped. Windows opened. No one intervened. But everyone remembered. That night, word reached Bumpy Johnson, and the next morning, Dutch Schultz received a message, not written, not spoken, but demonstrated. One of his collectors was found beaten and stripped of his coat on 135th Street. No money taken, no note left. Just a quiet, unmistakable warning. This was not chaos. This was controlled retaliation. Schultz laughed when he heard about it. He called Harlem emotional, said Bumpy Johnson was playing gangster, told his men he would come up himself and straighten it out. That decision led him to the nightclub on Lenox Avenue, the room where the silence waited. Schultz checked his watch. Bumpy Johnson was late, or so he thought. What Schultz did not understand, what he never fully grasped, was that in Harlem, timing was power. And Bumpy Johnson never arrived early to a confrontation. He arrived when the balance was already decided. Outside the club, men lined the sidewalks, pretending not to watch. Inside, the bartender poured drinks he knew would not be finished. Schultz's men shifted their weight, hands close to their coats. Then the door opened. Bumpy Johnson stepped inside without announcement. No entourage, no visible weapon. Just a calm, measured walk through the room, eyes forward, expression unreadable. The music stopped. Not because someone ordered it, because no one dared to keep playing. Bumpy removed his hat, placed it carefully on a chair. Then he looked directly at Dutch Schultz. The silence stretched. And in that silence, Dutch Schultz realized something he had never felt before. This man was not impressed by him, not afraid of him, and not interested in negotiation. The night Harlem took itself back had begun. Bumpy Johnson did not rush. That alone unsettled Dutch Schultz. Most men who walked into a room with Schultz moved fast. Too fast. They spoke quickly, over-explained, tried to prove something before he had even asked. Bumpy did none of that. He stood still, letting the weight of his presence settle, letting Schultz feel the room tilt. Schultz broke the silence first. "Well," he said, forcing a grin that didn't reach his eyes, "you finally decided to show up." Bumpy looked at him for a long moment before answering. When he spoke, his voice was low, steady, more courtroom than street corner. "I've been here all night," he said. "You just didn't know where to look." A few of Schultz's men shifted uncomfortably. The line wasn't loud. It wasn't threatening. But it carried something Schultz recognized too late. Control. Schultz gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit down. Let's talk business like gentlemen." Bumpy didn't move. "This isn't your office," Bumpy said, "and this isn't your neighborhood." The words landed clean. No profanity, no raised voice, just fact. Schultz leaned back, folding his arms. "Every neighborhood's somebody's until it ain't. I'm just here to make sure things run orderly, like everywhere else." Bumpy's eyes flicked briefly around the room. He noticed the men Schultz had brought. Outsiders, Bronx accents, unfamiliar faces. He also noticed Who wasn't there? Harlem men didn't attend meetings they didn't approve of. "You've been shaking down runners," Bumpy said, "beating people who don't work for you, slapping elders in the street." Schultz shrugged. "Business gets messy." Bumpy nodded slowly. "Then you picked the wrong business." The tension thickened. Schultz's smile faded. "You think you run this place?" he asked. "Because last I checked, numbers is numbers. Money is money, and money doesn't care who collects it." Bumpy finally stepped closer to the table. Not aggressive, just close enough that Schultz could smell his cologne. Clean, deliberate, expensive. "Money cares who bleeds for it," Bumpy said. "And in Harlem, we don't bleed for outsiders." That was the line. Schultz's hand tightened around his glass. "You're talking like you've got an army behind you." Bumpy met his gaze. "I don't need one." That answer didn't make sense to Schultz. Power, to him, was always visible. Guns, men, fear. But Bumpy's confidence came from something Schultz couldn't tax or kill. Belonging. Schultz stood up. "I didn't come here to be lectured," he said, voice sharp now. "I came to tell you how this is going to go. You step aside. My people collect. You get a cut if you behave yourself. That's generous." Bumpy's expression didn't change. "You're done collecting in Harlem," he said. Schultz laughed, loud and brittle. "You don't get to tell me where I am done." The laugh echoed too long, because no one joined it. Bumpy turned slightly, addressing the room rather than Schultz. "Every man here knows what happens when outsiders try to own what they don't understand." Schultz snapped, "Don't preach to me." Bumpy looked back at him. "Then listen." He leaned in, voice dropping. "You came here thinking this was about money. It isn't. This is about respect. And you've been spending it like you've got an unlimited supply." Schultz's face flushed. "I built my empire by not caring about respect." "And you're losing Harlem because of it," Bumpy replied. That was when Schultz made his final mistake. He waved one of his men forward, a thick-necked enforcer with a scar down his cheek. The man stepped closer to Bumpy, close enough to invade his space. "You see," Schultz said, "this is how I handle disagreements." The room held its breath. Bumpy did not flinch. He looked at the enforcer, then back at Schultz. "Call him off." Schultz smirked. "Or what?" Bumpy's answer was quiet. "Or I handle it." Schultz gestured. "Go ahead." The enforcer reached out, and in a blur that looked almost polite, Bumpy Johnson moved. He didn't throw wild punches. He didn't shout. He stepped inside the man's reach, twisted the arm, and drove him face first into the table. The crack of bone against wood sounded like a gunshot. The man collapsed, gasping. Bumpy straightened his jacket. No one else moved. Schultz stared, stunned, not by the violence, but by how controlled it was. This wasn't rage. This was instruction. Bumpy looked at Schultz again. "That's the last hand you raise in Harlem without permission." Schultz's men reached for their coats, and that was when the truth finally revealed itself. From the back of the room, from the hallways, from the street outside, Harlem men appeared, not rushing, not threatening, just present, blocking exits, filling space. Schultz's army suddenly looked very small. Bumpy hadn't come alone. He had come supported. Schultz swallowed. "This is how you want it?" he asked. "You think this ends well?" Bumpy nodded once. "It ends tonight." He stepped closer again, voice steady but unforgiving. "You leave Harlem. You pull your men out. You stop touching our people. And you don't come back. Schultz scoffed weakly. And if I don't? Bumpy leaned in until only Schultz could hear him. Then every dollar you try to take here will cost you 3 somewhere else. Your runners will vanish. Your collectors will quit. Your partners will question you. Not because I tell them to, but because they'll know you lost control. He paused. And men who lose control don't keep empires. Schultz sat back down. For the first time that night, he looked small. Outside, the music started again. Inside, Dutch. Schultz understood something he had never learned before. Harlem wasn't taken. It was defended. And tonight, it had judged him wanting. Dutch Schultz did not answer right away. He sat there, staring at the table, at the condensation sliding down his glass like time leaking away. For a man who had built his reputation on unpredictability, this pause was unfamiliar territory. Violence was his language. Fear was his currency. And yet, neither worked here. Bumpy Johnson waited. He did not gloat. He did not press. He allowed the silence to do the work. That silence was Harlem speaking. Schultz finally exhaled through his nose. You think this is over because you embarrassed me in a club? Bumpy shook his head. I think it's over because you don't belong here. Schultz's jaw tightened. You know how many men have told me that? And you know how many of them are still standing, Bumpy replied. The men around them shifted again. Schultz's people were starting to realize something uncomfortable, that they were not in a standoff. They were in a verdict. Schultz stood slowly, smoothing his coat. You want me gone? He said. Fine, I'll go. For now. Bumpy met his eyes. No, for now. Schultz smirked. You don't get to write the future. Bumpy's voice hardened. I get to protect my people. The future takes care of itself. Schultz picked up his hat. He looked around the room one last time, trying to reclaim some measure of dominance. But the eyes watching him were calm, unimpressed, certain. As he moved toward the door, he stopped. This neighborhood will eat you alive one day, Schultz said without turning. You get too big, the law comes. You get too small, someone like me comes back. Bumpy answered evenly. That's why Harlem doesn't belong to one man. Schultz hesitated, then walked out. The door closed behind him with a soft, definitive click. No cheers followed. No celebration. Because Harlem understood something Schultz never would. This wasn't about winning a fight. It was about holding a line. The consequences began immediately. Within 48 hours, Schultz's collectors stopped showing up north of 110th Street. The runners who had been pressured quietly returned to Harlem's established system. Word spread fast, not as rumor, but as confirmation. Dutch Schultz had been checked, and he had folded. Downtown, that kind of retreat was unheard of. In Harlem, it made sense. Power here was communal, not concentrated. Bumpy Johnson wasn't a tyrant issuing decrees. He was a stabilizer maintaining balance. Stephanie St. Clair called him the next morning. They heard you sent him home, she said, voice cool but pleased. I told him where the door was, Bumpy replied. A pause, then a soft laugh. Good, because he was getting careless. Careless was polite. Schultz's failed move into Harlem sent shockwaves through the underworld. Other bosses took notice, not just of the resistance, but of how disciplined it was. No bodies in the street, no public spectacle, just a clear boundary enforced with precision. That restraint unnerved people more than bloodshed ever could. Because it suggested planning. Schultz did not forget. Men like him never did. In the weeks that followed, whispers circulated about retaliation, about deals being cut, about pressure from higher up, from the commission, from Italian bosses who didn't like seeing precedents set. But something else happened. Schultz's own people started questioning him. They had watched him walk into Harlem with confidence and leave without leverage. They had seen a man who ruled through intimidation fail to intimidate. That kind of crack spreads. Collectors hesitated. Partners hedged. Rivals sensed weakness. Bumpy Johnson didn't push. He didn't need to. He focused on Harlem, strengthening ties, reinforcing systems, ensuring no vacuum existed that Schultz or anyone else could exploit. The numbers business ran smoother. Runners were protected. Elders were respected. Order returned. And order in Harlem was power. One night, weeks later, Bumpy sat in a small restaurant on 125th Street, eating quietly. A young man approached his table nervously. "Mr. Johnson," he said, "is it true you ran Schultz out?" Bumpy looked up, studied the boy's face, hopeful, curious, hungry for legend. "I didn't run anyone out," he said. "I reminded him where he was." The boy nodded, satisfied. That was how stories grew in Harlem, not exaggerated, not shouted, but passed along in measured tones. Truth didn't need decoration. For Dutch Schultz, the loss lingered. He lashed out elsewhere, picked fights he didn't need, made enemies he couldn't afford. His temper, always volatile, grew worse. He talked too much, trusted too little. And every time Harlem was mentioned, his jaw tightened. Because he knew. He hadn't just lost territory, he had lost face. In a world where perception shaped reality, that loss was fatal. Years later, when historians talked about the decline of Dutch Schultz, they pointed to many causes: his paranoia, his defiance of the mafia, his reckless ambition. But those who knew the streets told a quieter story. They talked about a night in Harlem when a man who thought himself untouchable learned the difference between fear and authority. They talked about Bumpy Johnson standing calm in a room full of enemies, enforcing a boundary without needing to cross it again. And they understood something fundamental. Power taken can be challenged. Power granted by a community must be respected. Harlem remembered that night, not for the threat of violence, but for its absence. Because true control doesn't announce itself. It simply endures. Dutch Schultz tried to convince himself the loss didn't matter. Men like him always did. He told his lieutenants Harlem was a distraction. That there was bigger money downtown, better angles in Brooklyn, safer alliances with Italian crews who respected raw force. He laughed when Harlem came up in conversation, laughed too loudly, too often. But privately, the loss gnawed at him. Because the night on Lenox Avenue hadn't just challenged his authority, it had exposed it. And exposure in Schultz's world was dangerous. The true confrontation didn't end in the nightclub. That was only the first exchange. The real test came weeks later when Schultz made one last attempt to reassert himself, not with fists, but with influence. He went to the police, not openly, not foolishly. Quiet conversations, carefully placed bribes, suggestions that Harlem's numbers operation was overdue for a crackdown. He didn't name Bumpy Johnson directly. He didn't have to. Raids began shortly after. Plainclothes officers flooded parts of Harlem. Runners were stopped. Ledgers seized. A few men were roughed up, not enough to make headlines, but enough to send a message. Schultz watched from a distance, satisfied. This was how he usually won. Pressure, attrition. Let the law do what guns didn't need to. What Schultz didn't understand was that Harlem had already prepared for this. Bumpy Johnson saw the raids coming before the first door was kicked in. Because Harlem talked. Because barbers, porters, doormen, and bartenders listened. And because Bumpy understood something Schultz never did. Authority doesn't just come from the streets or the courts. It comes from trust. When the raids started, Harlem didn't panic. It adjusted. Numbers books vanished overnight. Runners disappeared into legitimate jobs temporarily arranged through church networks and local businesses. Money was hidden not in back rooms, but in plain sight. Laundromats, funeral homes, social clubs that had weathered police scrutiny for decades. And when officers asked questions, they were met with calm cooperation and no information, no tips, no panic, no mistakes. The raids produced nothing. That failure embarrassed the precincts involved, and embarrassment travels upward. Soon, the pressure reversed. Bumpy didn't celebrate. He requested a meeting, not with Schultz, with the intermediaries, Italian fixers, Jewish businessmen, men who moved between worlds and understood leverage better than loyalty. He met them in neutral spaces, restaurants downtown, offices with clean floors and closed doors. His message was simple. Harlem is stable, he said, and stability is good for everyone. They listened, because stability meant predictable income, fewer police problems, no unnecessary attention. Chaos was bad for business, and Schultz had brought chaos. Word of those meetings reached Schultz. That was when his temper finally snapped. He ranted to anyone who would listen. Accused Bumpy of overstepping, of acting like a king, of forgetting his place. But every outburst confirmed what others were already thinking. Dutch Schultz was losing control. Not just in Harlem. Everywhere. The final face-to-face happened not in Harlem, but downtown. A chance encounter, though in their world, nothing was truly accidental. Bumpy Johnson was exiting a hotel lobby when Schultz entered, flanked by two men who looked tired rather than dangerous. They froze when they saw each other. The lobby stilled. Schultz stared, eyes burning. "You think you're clever," he said, voice low and sharp. Bumpy adjusted his gloves. "I think I'm careful." Schultz stepped closer. "You turned my own methods against me?" Bumpy met his gaze. "You taught me what not to do." That cut deeper than any threat. Schultz leaned in, voice trembling with restrained fury. "You're standing on borrowed time." Bumpy didn't back away. "So are you. The difference is, I know it." For a moment, it looked like Schultz might explode. Instead, he stepped back, because even here, downtown neutral ground, people were watching. And Schultz had learned what happened when he forced confrontations he couldn't control. He walked away. Again. That was the moment. The moment Dutch Schultz understood the loss was permanent. He would never reclaim Harlem, because Harlem had not merely resisted him, it had rejected him. The justice wasn't violent, it was systemic. Schultz's influence waned, his alliances frayed, his paranoia deepened. He began defying the Mafia Commission, believing he could bully his way through disputes that required diplomacy. That arrogance would eventually seal his fate. But Harlem would not be part of that ending. Harlem was done with him. For Bumpy Johnson, the aftermath was quieter, but more profound. Respect deepened, not because he had beaten a man, but because he had protected a community without burning it down. Elders spoke his name with approval. Young men learned that power didn't always look like shouting or bloodshed. Business continued, smoother and safer. Bumpy walked the streets openly, and no one questioned why. Years later, when Dutch Schultz lay dying from bullets fired by men he thought he could outmaneuver, Harlem barely noticed. Their battle had already been decided, on a night without gunfire, in a room filled with silence, where control changed hands without changing blood. The consequence of that night in Harlem wasn't written in headlines. It was written in behavior. Men stopped testing boundaries north of 110th Street. Collectors adjusted their routes. Outsiders asked permission or stayed away entirely. Harlem became something rare in the criminal world of New York. It became settled. That kind of settlement didn't come from fear of violence. It came from certainty. Everyone knew where the lines were, who enforced them, and why crossing them wasn't worth the cost. Bumpy Johnson didn't declare victory. He didn't need to. Harlem felt it. The people who noticed first weren't gangsters. They were shop owners, numbers runners who no longer had to look over their shoulders for unknown enforcers, mothers who saw fewer unfamiliar faces lingering on corners, pastors who found their congregations less shaken by rumors of raids and reprisals. Stability does that. It seeps into daily life quietly. And Harlem breathed easier. In the underworld, the shift was just as clear. Other crime bosses, Italian, Jewish, Irish, took careful note of what had happened, not because Dutch Schultz had been driven out violently, but because he had been outmaneuvered. That was more dangerous. Violence could be answered with violence. Structure required respect. Meetings were held where Harlem was discussed not as an opportunity, but as a jurisdiction, a place with its own internal order, a place where negotiations had to be handled delicately. Bumpy Johnson's name came up often in those conversations, always carefully. Schultz, meanwhile, spiraled. The Harlem loss haunted him. It replayed in his mind during sleepless nights. He fixated on the moment he realized the room was no longer his, on the silence that followed his laughter. On the way, Bumpy Johnson had stood unafraid. He tried to reclaim that feeling elsewhere, pushing harder, threatening louder, taking greater risks. He challenged men who had once been his equals. He ignored warnings, because men who lose control often mistake aggression for strength. The end came swiftly. In 1935, Dutch Schultz was gunned down in a Newark restaurant, betrayed by the same kind of organized authority he had defied for too long. As he lay bleeding, muttering incoherent thoughts, his empire collapsed in real time. Harlem did not mourn him. It remembered him as a lesson. For Bumpy Johnson, justice came not in Schultz's death, but in what followed. No retaliations, no power grabs, no chaos. Harlem continued on its path, self-regulated, vigilant, proud. Bumpy remained what he had always been, a guardian more than a tyrant. He enforced order, mediated disputes, and ensured outsiders understood the cost of disrespect. He was not beloved by everyone, but he was trusted, and in Harlem, trust was everything. A reporter once asked a long-time Harlem resident why Schultz had failed where others succeeded. The man thought for a moment. Because he wanted to own us, he said. Bumpy just wanted to protect us. That distinction mattered. It always would. The justice of that night wasn't revenge. It was balance restored. Dutch Schultz had come to Harlem believing power could be imposed. He left knowing it had to be earned, and he never earned it. Years later, when stories were told about Harlem's resilience, that night was spoken of quietly, not as a battle, not as a showdown, but as a moment when a community decided it would not be bullied and found a man capable of making that decision stand. Bumpy Johnson never bragged about it, but he carried the lesson forward in every negotiation, every warning, every measured response. Respect first, force only if necessary. That was the Harlem way. Would you like me to continue to part 6? Continue part 6 of the script. 850 words. The untold legend, the night Dutch Schultz lost control. Over Harlem time has a way of clarifying moments that felt uncertain when they happened. In the years that followed, that night on Lenox Avenue became a reference point, quietly cited, never exaggerated. When newcomers tested Harlem's boundaries, older men would shake their heads and say, "You don't know how this place learned to stand." They were talking about Dutch Schultz, and they were talking about Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy's reputation changed after that night. Before, he had been seen as an enforcer, capable, intelligent, dangerous when crossed. After Harlem, he was something else entirely. He became inevitable, not because he dominated every conversation, but because every outcome seemed to pass through him. Deals held because he said they would. Conflicts ended because he decided they should. Outsiders learned that bypassing him only created problems they couldn't solve. And unlike men who rose quickly and fell violently, Bumpy endured. That endurance was the true legacy of Harlem's stand. Historians later tried to frame the moment as part of a larger criminal chessboard, another move in the power struggles of Prohibition-era New York. But that missed the point. This wasn't about rackets. It was about dignity. Harlem in the 1930s was under constant pressure from discriminatory policing, exploitative landlords, predatory politicians, and outside criminal interests that saw black neighborhoods as easy targets. Control was something imposed from the outside, rarely defended from within. That night changed the narrative, not because Harlem rejected crime, but because it rejected disrespect. Bumpy Johnson embodied that distinction. When Bumpy later formed his controversial alliance with Lucky Luciano, people who understood Harlem knew why it worked. Luciano respected structure. He had seen what happened to men who ignored it, and he understood that Bumpy Johnson wasn't a man you conquered. He was a man you partnered with. That understanding traced back to Dutch Schultz's failure. Schultz had tried to take Harlem by force. Luciano approached it with diplomacy. One learned, one did not. Within Harlem, the story evolved into something more instructive than legendary. Older men told younger ones, power doesn't always shout. They talked about how Bumpy Johnson had walked into that club without raising his voice, how he had controlled the room by refusing to be rushed, refusing to be impressed, refusing to be baited. That kind of strength was rare, and it was contagious. The community remembered the absence of bloodshed as much as the outcome. In a city accustomed to settling disputes with funerals, Harlem had resolved one of its most serious threats with discipline and unity. That wasn't weakness. That was mastery. Decades later, when Harlem faced new challenges, new authorities, new pressures, new forms of exploitation, that lesson remained. You protect what's yours by knowing its value. You defend it by standing together, and you never mistake fear for respect. Bumpy Johnson died years later of natural causes in a way few men of his world ever did. When the news spread, Harlem mourned him not as a criminal king, but as a complicated protector, a man who had made hard choices in a hard time, a man who had drawn a line and held it. Dutch Schultz, by contrast, became a cautionary tale, a name spoken when someone pushed too far, too fast, a reminder that unchecked aggression invites collective resistance. His story ended violently. Bumpy's ended historically. That difference mattered. And at the center of both stories sat one quiet night in Harlem, where a man used to bending cities learned that some places do not bend. They stand. That night was never about Dutch Schultz. History just made it look that way. It was about a neighborhood that had been underestimated for too long. A community treated as territory instead of people. A place outsiders thought could be bought, bullied, or broken if the pressure was hard enough. Harlem proved otherwise. When Dutch Schultz walked into Harlem, he believed power was something you imposed. That fear traveled faster than respect. That money erased boundaries. He had built an empire on that belief, and it worked everywhere else until it didn't. Because Harlem wasn't governed by intimidation alone. It was governed by memory, unity, and quiet lines that did not need to be written down. And Bumpy Johnson understood that better than anyone. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He didn't need to. He stood where he belonged and refused to move. That was the moment control changed hands. Not with gunfire, not with headlines, but with a community deciding it would no longer be treated as disposable. Dutch Schultz lost Harlem the same way many powerful men lose everything, by confusing fear with authority and arrogance with strength. And once that illusion shattered, there was no way to put it back together. Bumpy Johnson didn't win a war that night. He prevented one. And in doing so, he secured something far more lasting than territory. He secured dignity. Because this story isn't just about one gangster losing control. It's about what happens when respect is demanded and enforced by those who have every reason to defend it. Sometimes history doesn't change with explosions. Sometimes it changes in silence. And sometimes it takes a legend to remind the world that power only lasts as long as the people allow it to. That was the night Dutch Schultz learned that Harlem was not his to take. And the night Harlem proved it never would be.